Thank you for taking the time to join us for our Demand-Driven Supply Chain Strategy webinar hosted by the Supply Chain and Logistics Institute at the Georgia Tech Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering. Today our speaker is Dr. Maria Rey-Marston. She's the instructor for our 3.5-day course being taught July 9th through 12th on the Georgia Tech campus. Maria is also Senior Advisor with MRM Partners and a seasoned consultant who has developed and delivered many of our custom courses for clients here in the U.S., Latin America, Spain, Portugal, and many other locations. Maria has a BS in Economics, a Science and Technology Project Management Diploma, a Master's in International Affairs, a Master's of Science in International Logistics and Supply Chain Strategy here from Georgia Tech, and a PhD in Performance Management from the Cranfield School of Management. Her research and consulting activities focus on the design and use of performance management systems, and her academic and teaching activities center on supply chain strategy, outsourcing and interfirm relationship management, and the strategic connection between supply chain and financial performance. With that introduction, I will turn the webinar over to Maria.
Welcome everybody to Georgia Tech. My name is Maria Rey, and thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. Today's webinar is a quick summary of most of the topics that we will address during our upcoming 4-day course on how to design a supply chain strategy and how the strategy should fit with your overall corporate strategy. So let me get started, and please feel free to post any questions in the question panel. If you want to raise your hand, we will be able to find a point in the presentation to address some of your questions and some of your comments. To begin with, I would like to get started again by welcoming you to Georgia Tech. And this is our virtual campus, but we hope to have you in our physical one at some point, hopefully in July. As I mentioned, the topics of today are about supply chain strategy. But before we start talking about supply chain, I would like to get started talking about demand, because one of the characteristics of effective and innovative supply chain strategies is that most of them are very strongly related to managing demand and being driven by demand. And just to get started with the conversation about demand, I want to introduce you to some of these concepts of being demand-driven by using a very simple example from our daily lives. So let's talk about television. And you may say, well, what television has to do with a course on supply chain strategy? Well, if you imagine the origins of television, it was really a supply-driven entertainment system. You had a defined content. You were supposed to tune into that content because it was broadcasted at a fixed time. And really, nobody cared in the early days of television of the needs of the viewers or the needs of the audience. It was really a supply-driven process. Now, over time, we started getting more and more flexible. And most of you, I imagine, have some sort of on-demand television. You have some defined content, but you can tune in at your convenience in flexible times. And sometimes we just tune in and catch up on some programs after we've been out of town for a few days or something like that. And it's making progress in terms of the needs of the audience. Today, we also, imagine some of you may be subscribers of Netflix, not only in the U.S. but worldwide, where you can also actually not only have on-demand delivery, but you can actually do on-demand content. And if you're avid TV watchers, some of you have been noticing that this concept of Netflix is really the advent of demand-driven television, where they actually capture the data, actually suggest some programs for you. They have the processes that actually will allow them to know which programs are more popular. And recently, in a new series they just launched, they're being able to actually customize some of the endings and some of the content and the stories of some of the series that Netflix is sponsoring out there. So basically what we're looking at is a changing world from a very supply-driven entertainment to a very demand-driven entertainment. And one of our ideas is that what's happening to all of us through social networks and the role of technology actually is not too far away from also shaping what supply chain management is going to be in the future. So what I'd like to propose to you during this 1-hour webinar is actually a summary of our upcoming course, where we're going to be talking about what it means to be demand-driven, what are some of the new fundamentals of our traditional supply chain views and processes, and how can you help your organization become more demand-driven. So let's get started with the first part, and I encourage you to start thinking if you know of other examples in addition to my example about television, if you know of other examples about how the world is becoming more and more demand-driven, and I'm sure you can think of some ideas in your industry or your market. So let's talk about this concept of supply networks and demand-driven supply networks. First of all, I want to touch upon this evolution of demand-driven and why we're talking about supply networks as opposed to supply chains. And I know we still use the term supply chains, but in reality we're referring more to networks, and I will explain to that in a minute. So let's get started with that. The origin and the evolution of the concept of demand-driven, actually it's a very simple one. We all started with the traditional elements of any economic system, and some of these elements have been since the 18th century in the origins of economics, where you have supply, you have demand, and you have a product. In this case, you may have buyers, which will be your demand, you have products, and you have sellers that will be your supply. The origin of this is actually very closely tied, as I mentioned, to economic systems. What we did in supply chain, starting with this concept around the mid-80s, from the early contributions of Porter around value chains, is that we took some of these elements of the economic system and actually we stretched them out. So we started with these concepts of supply chain, which is actually the combination of all the parties that are involved, from your suppliers to your end consumers, to actually deliver and make those products flow in that particular chain. So when you ask people about the definition of supply chain, they will say, you know, it's the combination of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, customers, and consumers that will allow you to manage in an appropriate way the flow of goods, the flow of information, and the flow of funds. Now, some of those definitions, if you imagine, are almost 30 years old. And what we like to do now is imagine what is that evolution of supply chain that is really shaped by demand and shaped by technology that can capture demand signals. The discussion started actually in 2004. And if some of you remember, 2004 was actually the burst of the e-commerce bubble here in the U.S. and around the world. And in 2004, AMR Research, which is now part of the Gartner Group, started analyzing some of the companies that were more successful after the dot-com burst versus some companies that really burst. And what they figured out is that all of these companies kept the same structure of functions and processes to manage demand, to manage products, and to manage supply. But the successful companies were actually able to integrate and create an intersection between those three functions. And in reality, what they were capable of doing was very early capture demand signals, and this is just an example of our new Coca-Cola vending machine. We call it here a freestyle machine, where you can actually create your own flavors, and the machine knows how many people are going by, what kind of drinks are mixing. And companies that are very good at managing some of those signals are making this transition from traditional supply chains that are just responding to demand by meeting some of these service level requirements at the lowest possible cost, and making this transition to some of these networks that are managing the business based on some demand signals and shaping demand before they can respond to this demand in a profitable way. So in today's world, basically our future supply chains and the current successful supply chains are really targeting where demand signals come from, and they're being very successful managing some of those demand signals to create a more efficient supply chain response process. So this brings me to the second point regarding some of these new fundamentals that we will review in class, and is why we're looking at not only supply chains, but really supply networks that can be responsive to some of these demand signals. And let me get you started with a little story, an anecdote here from Georgia Tech. In the year 2000, it sounds like a long time ago, we actually held here at Georgia Tech one interesting forum or symposium where we were discussing the supply chain and logistics implications of e-commerce. And back then, we invited the former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, who was talking to us about the differences between the traditional logistics and transportation culture versus the Internet and the e-commerce culture. And one of the things he said, and we happen to agree with him, is that the transportation and logistics culture is kind of rigid. It's slow to deploy, it's very expensive, it's very rigid and difficult to modify. So when we were thinking about that kind of culture, then the word chain came to mind. And typically when we talk about a supply chain and this connection between suppliers and manufacturers and retailers, it tends to be depicted almost like a stable, rigid structure. Now, if you take a look at the traditional graphics that will show a supply chain structure, you see a very sequential, very bidirectional structures with some nodes and very specific roles for each one of those nodes in that particular system. But if you take a look at the Internet and e-commerce culture, typically the information networks, communication networks, that is a much faster structure, much more adaptable, much more flexible and relatively cheap or less expensive to deploy, and that's the concept of a network. And it's just not a matter of semantics, because we truly believe that the future of supply chain strategy has to incorporate the fact that that chain is really a network, and that is not any particular strategy, it's a demand-driven strategy. So think about this demand network, and just imagine of the millions of people that are currently enabled by smartphones and computers and laptops and tablets and iPads everywhere, just telling us where they are, what they're doing, where they're located, what are they looking for. And you're really looking at a network that is omnidirectional, that has sensors along the way, that has perhaps a centralized logic with a very strong local execution, but it has very flexible paths that allow us to interact with that node in the network in real time. So if you imagine what technology has enabled today to know who is that person, what is she doing, what is she looking for, what is going to be next in her path, really you're looking at a transformation of traditional supply chains into these supply networks that will allow you to have structures that are more flexible, more automated, self-repairing, and of course with sensors along the way. The last point I want to make here in this section of the new fundamentals of demand-driven supply networks, it's about what we call the target algorithms. Very early, and early as when I was a student here at Georgia Tech in the master's program, this was our basic mantra to achieve in supply chain management. Our goal was to minimize our total supply chain costs And our objective was to meet the constraints or to meet the requirements for our customer service policy. So we have spent almost a century, if you will, since the advent of industrial engineering, trying to minimize cost and trying to use those service levels as a target or a constraint to achieve. What we're really looking today in some of these demand-driven supply networks is that even though we still want to minimize supply chain costs, it's not enough. And even though we would like to meet some customer service levels that we agreed upon, it's just not enough. What we really are trying to do is really to contribute to shareholders' value creation and to contribute to the financial performance and to the sustainability of the business. And that's a very different algorithm to look at supply chains. So one of the things that we will discuss in class in July is what are some of the new performance metrics and how some of the traditional efficiency metrics that we used to have, which is a very traditional optimization approach, are really evolving into more metrics that are closely tied with the sustainability of the business and with some of the financial performance that are of interest for top management and the C-level executives. So bear in mind that when you are doing a supply chain strategy, you're really looking at not only the lowest possible cost or the most efficient process, you're also looking at what are the processes that will allow you to manage some of these individual demand signals and create the greatest benefit for the business as a whole and for the sustainability of the business model. This discussion about supply networks in the 21st century also include the fact that we have to fulfill a demand promise, but also that we have to maximize total financial performance for the corporation, not only the minimization of supply chain costs. If at this point you may have any questions regarding performance measures or some of those new fundamentals, then please be free to post them.
We do have one question from the audience. The question is, how is a supply chain different from a supply chain network?
I know to some of you this may seem like semantics, like we academics are coming up with a new acronym and we don't like SCM, we like SNM now, but I'll tell you the differences are very, very fundamental. Number one, you are moving from a linear structure into a much more amorphous, self-designing structure. Secondly, you're moving from members of the supply chain with very specific roles and very specific positions in the chain to nodes in the network that may change their location, may change their missions, may be in or out of the network at a particular time and point. So I can elaborate with this a little bit more, but I will urge you to do a little bit of Google research as well. And if you type differences between chains and networks, some of these differences will be more apparent.
I don't know, somebody asked about economies of scale. I'm not sure if you can address that.
Well, I think both for networks and chains, economies of scale are important because they will drive not only optimal processes and costs, but also if you're targeting top-line performance in terms of revenues and growth, of course, scale is important. And if in your business, scale is critical for your profitability or your top-line growth, certainly when you design a supply network strategy, you should consider that particular set of processes that can be scalable. Let me continue with this discussion and introduce you a little bit into some of the new processes that are really part of the new discussion about demand-driven supply networks. When we studied traditional supply chain management, we used to speak about processes like inventory planning, procurement, transportation, distribution, things of that nature. Really, when you are planning on building a demand-driven strategy, demand management is at the center of your processes, and most of these processes are highly interdependent. I won't have the time today to go into all the detail about these 4 processes, but I'll give you a quick definition of our view of the 4 processes that should be addressed in a demand-driven strategy. The first one is the concept of demand creation. And again, let me go back to my chart of the traditional components of demand, product, and supply. And when you look at these components versus the traditional supply chain processes, and this is just an example of the SCORE model that scopes the processes as source, make, deliver, return, and plan, then I hope you will see the difference that we're seeing right now. When we look at demand networks or demand-driven supply networks, you imagine how you get started with some of these processes. And I'm using this chart from Gardner that says, why do we need to talk about, or why do we need to be demand-driven? So this is a quick example that I love, and it says, imagine a company where you have a new product development group or somebody that is just launching a new range of products and services. So you may have a group of people defining, designing, supporting, promoting a particular product. So let's say they're successful and they came up with a very successful new product. Then they go to their supply group, maybe somebody in manufacturing, somebody in procurement, and say, listen, we want to make this product. Why don't you go ahead and source the raw materials, design the best manufacturing processes, and figure it out all the logistics of taking that product to market. Once the product is made, probably you will engage, or a typical company will engage with the commercial or the marketing group, trying to imagine how can we create demand for this new product? How can we attract customers, sell this product, serve the product better in the market? And most companies, you know, follow this particular sequence, if you will, of decisions. New product, go ahead and make it. It's made, here it is, go sell it. And everybody in sales and marketing said, yep, we're up to the task. Here we go. We think we can sell it. Well, this situation is so prevalent that actually statistics show that less than 1 in 10 new product launchings are successful, and over 75% of engineering hours in new product development may go to waste. So what we would like to propose here is this development of new competencies so organizations actually learn to be more demand-driven. And this means that these new processes are really new capabilities on a firm. One of those is the ability to create demand. So before we go ahead and create new products, the question becomes here, what is the demand that can be created for that particular solution? Secondly, we talk about demand sensing, which is the ability to read how the market is reacting to that particular product, what are some of the signals associated with that particular transaction or product in the market. And then if we get very, very good, and this is something people in sales and marketing are good at it, we will have the capability to shape demand. And finally, we start or we enter with our traditional supply chain processes, really as a demand response capability. And I'm going to start thinking or asking you to think about how good are your 4 capabilities within your own company. And if some of you have already experience with sales and operations planning committees and sales and operations or sales and execution planning or consensus instances, you may have already started this development of competencies to actually create or make decisions in a more responsive and a more proactive way based on demand signals. During class, we will review a few case studies, but one of the case studies we typically like to follow in class is Amazon.com, because Amazon is really a premier example of mastering these 4 capabilities of creating, sensing, shaping, and responding to demand. So think about if you know any other organization or other organizations that you think have mastered some of these capabilities. I just have here some numbers from Amazon, but mostly to tell you that when you master some of these capabilities, you also reap some of the big rewards in terms of growth and in terms of market share. So let me just go through here. This is just a sample of Amazon's demand-driven business model. So this is a question for you. If you know what it takes to be demand-driven, which is the capability of creating, sensing, shaping, and responding to demand, do you know of a company or a business model that, in your opinion, it's a very successful demand-driven business model and, of course, a very successful demand-driven supply network?
We're going to pause for a moment. If you could type in your answers in the questions window. If you can think of any other companies.
This is not a quiz. You will have your exercises and your projects and problems in class, but it will be interesting to know if you already feel in tune with this concept of demand-driven and can think about of any examples.
I've got quite a few. I have Apple, Google. Somebody mentions Walmart, Coca-Cola, the example before, John Deere, Zara, apparel company.
I love those examples. I think Zara in particular is a fantastic example on being demand-driven. I think it's a strong company in demand creation, and it shapes demand beautifully. I'll say Walmart is evolving their traditional supply chain view of being responsive and cost-effective and trying to shape demand and actually create demand in a more effective way than just purely being efficient from a cost perspective. And I think John Deere, especially in the service parts, I agree with you. It's a very good example. Coca-Cola, I think freestyle vending machines are great examples of a demand-driven customer interface. It creates demand for new flavors. It shapes demand. It senses demand in response to demand, all in the same machine. So we will work more on those cases when we see each other in July. Now, let me get started with the last portion of this webinar, which is, again, a quick summary of some of our discussions in July. The last portion here is, if you agree that we are experiencing an evolution on our traditional supply chains and the importance of being demand-driven, and if you buy into the idea of these new cross-enterprise processes that are managed in a more interdependent way, then usually I get this question is, how do I become more demand-driven? If I've been a traditional supply chain optimizer, how do I become more demand-driven? And we've worked with companies for the last 10 years in this very same question. And I will tell you, there are all kinds of engineering capabilities that you need, probably new technologies that you have to bring in place. But to me, the key to becoming more demand-driven is really a cultural transformation of the people that are actually designing and leading some of these processes and this strategy. So I hope you agree with this, but these are my 3 top common denominators of becoming more demand-driven. The first one is have a framework that organizes your thinking around demand-driven. It is really hard to be demand-driven when you still work with very linear descriptions or depictions of your supply chain. Secondly, I'm going to talk about empathy. And you may think, well, what empathy has to do with supply chain engineering? Well, I'll tell you. If you want to be demand-driven, being more empathetic will be one of the most important drivers of your transformation. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the role of technology in a demand-driven world. So let me get started with the first one. How do you become demand-driven? By getting the right framework that organizes your thinking around it. I have nothing against the SCORE model. I actually think it's a very interesting way to organize our traditional thinking on supply chain. However, I will tell you, when you look at the traditional framework of the SCORE model with the supplier, my company as a focal point, the customer of my customer, and the traditional processes of supply chain planning, sourcing, procurement, making, delivery, you don't see demand management there, at least not explicitly. Some people may say under deliver we have demand, but I will tell you, if you work with the wrong framework or with a framework that is not really a demand-driven framework, then you may experience difficulty transforming your supply chain into a demand-driven network. I love the Amazon business model, mostly because it is very explicit how this business model is centered around demand. In this case, or in the case of Amazon, it's centered around the customer experience as shoppers of Amazon.com. And if any of you are customers or shoppers of Amazon.com, as I am, and you find things like Amazon Prime, Moms and Babies, Amazon Fresh in the North U.S., Zappos, or things of that nature, you will see a very clear business model that is centered around demand. This is a business model that we followed and that I'll be happy to explain in more detail in July, that actually takes some of the traditional functions and capabilities of a company and actually organizes them around creating demand, sensing demand, shaping and responding to demand. So whatever is the framework you use, just find something that is really centered on demand as the driver of your processes, and that will be your first step to be more demand-driven. The second thing you could do to be more demand-driven is be empathetic. You know, most of our supply chains have been designed around products, around what is the SKU that I need to move, what is the investment in inventory, how do I source this product. But if you really want to be demand-driven, you really have to put customers, consumers, shoppers at the center of your analysis. This is just a small example of a tool that is widely available on the internet called empathy maps, where you actually start thinking about what the customer thinks and feels, what are their preoccupations and aspirations, what do they see when they interact with us, what do they say and do when they appear in public, and what is their behavior, what does the customer hear when we say something, when influencers say something about our company. So if you really want to become more demand-driven, being empathetic is going to be critical for your transformation, because it's going to make you aware of the signals and the needs of those particular customers and shoppers out there. The third point in how you could become more demand-driven is something about the role of technology in supply chain strategy and supply chain management. Honestly, in 2013 and beyond, it is going to be impossible, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, it's going to be impossible to manage a demand-driven network unless you have a digital strategy and a technology strategy to go with your supply chain. And in this case, when we talk about Amazon as a case, one of the things that Amazon understood very, very well is that even though in the early 2000s and even as close as early as 2010, only 7% of the shopping in the United States was digital only, they realized that 30% of the market in the U.S. was becoming digitally influenced. So from the very beginning, companies like Amazon actually planned a strategy to go digital in all of their demand management capabilities. Today, Amazon can create demand by sending you the right email with the right information at the right time, personalized to you, actually with history of your shopping, past shopping in your company. They understood that according to some experts in the retail world, by 2020, digital shopping is going to be close to 21%. And actually, we're going to have a reversal of the way we used to shop in the 20th century. So more cases we will discuss, but what I will tell you is that data is what connects all of the internal business functions in efforts like what we're seeing today in sales and operations planning. It is not without data that you can make some of the decisions that will connect demand, supply, and product. So my recommendation to all of you is really get serious about the technology role that some of these new applications and hardware and devices will play in some of your decisions to make a demand-driven supply network strategy. I wanted to put this here because sometimes people will say, this is all hype and this is just like another bubble around mobility and cloud and you know, this is just going to go away. This is so new. Actually, this is not tested. In 1987, a very insightful author, Stanley Davis, wrote a book called Future Perfect. And back then, he was talking about real time. And he was saying, you know, people talk about real time as if everything has to be online. And the definition of real-time supply chains or real-time strategies really will mean that you're going to get signals or inputs from the market that come back to you fast enough and with enough quality that will guide you in the decision-making process and in the subsequent inputs that you will make into the process. So this is not a new conversation. We've been talking about real-time processes for the last 30 years, and I think now the difference is that we have the technology really to connect, to engage, to enable all of these demand signals in that path to consumption that we would like to see in the future. At this point, I want to stop on this third point, and so far we have covered three elements that we will be expanded at a later point. We've been talking about the new fundamentals of demand-driven supply networks. We've talked about this evolution from traditional supply chains to demand-driven networks. We've talked about some of the capabilities that demand-driven companies have and some of the interdependencies across these processes. So we briefly touch upon concepts like demand creation, demand sensing, demand shaping, demand response. And I just shared with you three things that we have seen in the last decade help companies become more demand-driven, be more organized with the right framework, be empathetic, and go digital. So I'm going to stop here and close with a final question to all of you. In this discussion about demand-driven supply networks, early in the 2000s, Gartner proposed 4 stages where you could be classified in terms of your evolution towards a demand-driven supply network. These 4 stages will correspond to the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. So what I'd like you to do is hear me out as I describe the 4 stages and tell me, where do you think your organization is? Do you think you're stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4? So let me get a go with this. Stage 1, they call it the reactive phase, where the supply chain is in a state of permanent response, firefighting. It's always changing decisions, reallocating resources. People are on their cell phones. They can't come to class because they're always on the phone taking emails and answering to the latest emergency. I'm not saying it's not effective. It's a very reactive supply chain. Second phase, a supply chain that is in an anticipatory stage. It's aware of the need to shape demand. It's starting to internally planning for more profitable response and is doing a better job anticipating demand needs, is in the early stages of coordinating decisions with sales, marketing, promotions, supply, things of that nature. The third stage is what we call the collaborative stage, where some of these internal coordinated planning efforts are actually extending outside of the firm and actually involving some of the other partners in that network. So it's trying to maximize a profitable demand response, not only for the firm itself, but also for the firm's partners, and in this case could be channels, suppliers, or customers. The last phase is what Gardner called the orchestrating phase. I call it the more directive phase, and it actually shows a supply network that is really demand-driven, that has created sustainable value, and that is able to customize demand responses for the different demand signals that it gets out there. So we will go into more detail again at a later point, but I'd like you to share with us which numbers do you think you are, and we'll see if that matches some of the research we have done here at Georgia Tech.
I have a stage 1, definitively. I've got, looks like the majority is stage 2, between 2 and 3. Yeah, but I'm seeing a lot of 1s and 2s.
Well, you know, it's not surprising. There's nothing wrong with it. We've been taught and we've been planning for stages 1 and 2 for the last 25 years. It's not surprised that we're in those stages. We would like to move you definitely to 2 and 3. And for some more mature demand networks, clearly you can plan some of the stages of a more orchestrating supply network. So let me close with the last few remarks. If you know where you are, and seems like you guys know where you are, and you have that awareness of your current situation, and also if you know where you want to go, what is your objective in a particular channel or product line or particular market, then we would like to invite you to join us in July and continue this conversation on how do you design strategy for demand-driven supply networks, and hopefully that will be an opportunity to explore how to design it, how to fit it with the rest of the strategy of your corporation, and also something that is very important for us. How can we make supply chain executives and professionals much more relevant to the top management of the organization so you guys can enjoy and join the strategic conversation in your own companies? Andy, we'll close this webinar. If there are a few questions, I'll be happy to take them. In the meantime, here is my email. Here are the dates of our upcoming course, and we would love to have you in our upcoming course in July.
I am receiving some questions. The first one is, if I'm not a supply chain person but work in other functions that interact with supply chain management, what's the value of this course?
Believe it or not, some of the strongest participation we get in this course are sometimes from finance people or people in sales and marketing that deal with supply chain issues or professionals all the time. I think if you're not precisely a supply chain professional or manager, you could actually understand how do we think in supply chain, how can supply chain help you achieve some of your more functional goals, and make sure that you understand some of the objectives of the organization as a whole and how to be more empathetic to demand needs.
I'm getting several questions. One is, I need to know if this course will help me to fix my supply chain in a very embryonic status.
I think, it depends on what do you mean by fixing your supply chain. And let me be upfront with you in the real scope of the course. If your problem is to balance the routes in your distribution strategy and be able to load your trucks more efficiently and maximize your capacity, I will tell you, you need to come to the transportation and distribution course because that's a very specific operational course. This course is more strategic in nature rather than operational in nature. So if your supply chain in this embryonic stage could benefit, as I imagine it could, from a renewed positioning with the rest of the organization and just decide how can you contribute in a more effective way to the goals of your corporation, I will say that yes, this course will help you evolve your embryonic supply chain into a more mature one.
Yeah, I guess we had another question along this line of shouldn't this start at the CEO level?
It should in some cases, but not everything is top-down these days. I think we live in an age of social networks and emerging strategy. If you're curious about this, we are going to review some of the works by Henry Mintzberg on strategy formulation. And one of the things he says is that not all strategy is top-down. Some strategy is bottom-up or middle-up. And we believe that we can do strategy in the supply chain operational mid-level and going upwards. And not every answer has to come from the top down. So if you can influence, and you could, your CEO and your top management, we need you in the course. It will be great if your CEO wants to join us, but I doubt it. So we count on you influencing your top management.
Okay, we have another question. In a commodity market, which is price sensitive, how do we achieve DDSN?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and actually it's a point of discussion today because some supply chains are supply-driven, not demand-driven, and we will talk about that. If your supply chain depends on the price of a commodity, either metals, oil, fruits, vegetables, or anything that is highly volatile, you may be needing to be more attuned of supply signals rather than demand signals. But still, you may be a demand-driven supply network because you need to shape demand in order to fit it with the current situation in the sourcing or the supply market.
Okay. We have a question: how applicable may this course and its content be for Latin America?
I'll tell you, this course is geography independent, is industry independent. We are not talking in this course about anything that is not worldwide available, and any Latin American company or company in any emerging markets, and I know we have friends from Lebanon and friends from other emerging markets, the concepts of strategy formulation, the concepts of aligning your supply chain strategy with the company strategy, the concepts of being demand-driven. As long as you have suppliers and customers in your market, and as long as you're doing logistics and supply chain, regardless of where you're located, the contents of this course, I guarantee you, will be 100% applicable.
Yeah, I think that lends well to Alfredo's question about if the course would be pertinent to a startup company that's basing its strategy on a demand-driven basis.
Absolutely, yes.
We had another question about like how long is the course, what are the key topics covered?
The course is 4 days, actually 3 days and 4 hours. We start on Tuesday, July 9th, here at the Georgia Tech Global Learning Center, and we end on Friday, July 12th, around noon. So it's 3.5 days, and you can take a look at this link where some of the more detailed description of the course are presented. Typically on the first day, we go about some of the principles of strategy and strategy formulation. We review some of the fundamental tenets of demand-driven supply networks. We start playing with a couple of cases that we review. We also play with a simulation during the course that is an example of a company that is being transformed into a demand-driven supply network and all the pains of that transformation. We will talk about sustainable supply networks. We will talk about performance measures in this new evolution. And we will have a guest speaker talking about the role of technology in supply networks, in strategy for supply networks. So it's 3.5 days. It's a lot of fun, people from different industries, from different companies, and we try to keep it not as a huge course. You're not going to see 90 people in our classroom. We try to keep a number that allows us for conversation and take a look at your individual needs and your individual questions and problems. So we're looking forward to seeing you here in July.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. For those of you who are interested in coming to our demand-driven supply chain strategy course, you can visit www.scl.gatech.edu/DDSCS and learn more about the course, download the brochure, find out more about the topics that are covered. I do also want to mention that you can find us on Facebook at Georgia Tech SCL. We're on Twitter at GTSCL. We have a LinkedIn group if you search for us, and we will also post this archive to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/GTSCL. You can also go out there and view the archives of some of our other past webinars. Thank you for attending. Have a great rest of your day.